Good evening. Haiti Oropesa with Florida U Judge, and we are live at 6 o'clock. And I have a special guest today, bringing to you the electorate, especially those of you who are going to be voting in Pinellas and Pasco counties, a local election. Those are very important. National ones are important, but so are locals, the ones that affect us here locally. Allison Miller, she is joining me tonight, and good evening, Allison. We've been chatting a little bit before going live. I just wanted her to come on, and hopefully some of you will be tuning in the next couple of minutes. If not, it's always going to be left as a pre-record, and you can hear some of the points that she's going to be addressing that are part of her platform. And so, give me 1 second. I'm going to mute myself one moment just to see who this might be. Hold on. Okay, and so I'm back. It is 6:01, and we have someone that joined. Allison Miller. She is going to run for state attorney in the Pinellas and Pasco counties, which is the 6th Circuit of Florida. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And I think you would be the first woman prosecutor in this circuit, yes?
Yes. A woman has never run for the position, let alone held it. So yes, thank you so much for having me, Haiti. My name is Allison Miller, and I am running for the state attorney for the 6th Judicial Circuit, which is all of Pinellas and all of Pasco counties. I think most of you that know me know that I have been a career public defender. I was a PD in the 6th Circuit with Pinellas and Pasco for about 13 years. I actually started my career at the public defender's office in Tallahassee, working in Leon County. But I am hoping to share a little bit about myself personally and what called me to run in this race that perhaps, folks don't know about me. So just a little bit about my history. I've kind of grown up all over. I was born in Texas. I lived in North Carolina. I went to high school in Orlando before I went to college at the University of Notre Dame. I am Catholic, and so a lot of my positions on social justice originate from the Catholic Church. But I was a victim of violent crime. When I was 15, I was held at gunpoint in Orlando. And when I was 22, I was raped in college. And those two instances, although I'm not certain at the time I had this much clarity, but in law school, when I was sort of struggling to figure out where I wanted to end up and what I wanted to do, I very much felt called to criminal justice because of those things that had happened to me. And I genuinely felt like I could be on either side of the aisle. I believe in the pursuit of justice. I believe in our Bill of Rights and all 10 amendments contained in those Bill of Rights to our United States Constitution. And when I started my career, some of you do know this, my husband and I actually met in law school in Tallahassee. We both went to Florida State Law. And his family is from Sarasota, and my parents were in Orlando at the time. And so we decided to kind of split the difference and resettle in Tampa Bay after we graduated. And I actually interviewed with both the public defender's office in the 6th Circuit and the state attorney's office. I actually interviewed with my opponent, Bruce Bartlett, and Richard Ripplinger. Very much enjoyed the interview and genuinely left both interviews with Mr. Dillinger and company, as well as the state attorney's office, thinking I could work in either of these places. I also applied and interviewed at the PD and the state attorney's offices in Hillsborough County. And Mr. Dillinger happened to have offered me a job about an hour after I passed the bar. And I started working at the public defender's office the next day, which I feel is a serendipitous event in my life and has largely directed the course of my life.
But how long were you there?
13 years. I resigned to run. It didn't seem to be a good idea to be running against the man who was prosecuting literally all of our office's clients. And so I'm now in private practice with the law firm Ripley, Wisenhunt, doing largely the same type of work. But at the PD's office before I left, most recently, I was supervising both of our offices in Pasco County and Newport Richey and Dade City, and I was defending or responsible for supervising all of the capital cases in both Pinellas and Pasco. And so
so let's ask you a question about that.
Sure.
We were speaking earlier, and some people have this notion, and you said you wanted to clear that up, because some people are of the notion that, or I think maybe, I don't know where that's coming from. Maybe it's from your opponent, or persons within the team of your opponent are putting out kind of murmurings that you're going to be soft on crime, right? That you're going to be like one of these progressive state attorney candidates, like it was said of across the bridge, Andrew Warren. And
Right.
so address that. Is that something, like, I want you to address capital punishment, and whether defund the police,
Yeah.
something that I've heard too about progressive, like they're being stereotyped. Oh, here
Right.
comes this progressive liberal who's going to come in and is going to cause havoc here and is going to threaten our public safety. Address those two things.
Well, I find the idea that I'm going to be soft on crime or let all the criminals out, frankly, offensive. I live in Pinellas County. I live in St. Petersburg with my family, which includes my 6-year-old daughter and my husband. My elderly parents live around the corner. And so I consider my most important job on this planet is to protect my child. And the idea that I would do anything to make these communities less safe is untrue, and it's offensive. And anyone that knows me and is perpetuating that knows that to be untrue. I do not believe in defunding the police. I'm supportive of law enforcement. I think that in order for me to be successful in what I hope to accomplish in protecting these communities, in increasing our public safety, in making these communities more well-rounded and safe, I am going to have to partner with law enforcement to a certain extent, and law enforcement is going to have to partner with me as state attorney. And I have no problem with that. I also believe very strongly in holding people accountable for their actions, sort of regardless of the position that they hold. Not sure what else you asked me.
Well, here's the thing. So you care about public safety. As I'm a
Right.
criminal defense attorney, I think that law enforcement, with the services that they give in protecting us, that's very important. I
Of
support
course.
that.
Of
So
course.
I want to live in a community that's safe.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and so
but what's the balance? The balance is you have to have a nice delicate balance where people's constitutional rights are not violated, where you don't get the wrong person and arrest the wrong person or violate the right. So talk to us about that balance.
right.
You
Well,
don't sacrifice public safety just because you want to have an ideal or work every day to get a better ideal criminal justice system.
but that's what's frustrating is somehow, and it's really not a partisan thing, but somehow this messaging of tough on crime or law and order, and I use those in quotes because I think of myself as smart on crime. But the idea of these tough on crime, law and order, lock everybody up policies, that's somehow been perpetuated over time as what's necessary to keep our communities safe. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And so that's what I find infuriating is Mr. Bartlett, when he was appointed by the governor as acting state attorney and interviewed by the Tampa Bay Times, said the thing that makes the state attorney's office the most effective is the lack of change, which is frankly when I decided to run against him. Because I think I know probably better than most defending capital crime that violence is getting more violent, recidivism is growing, recidivism that leads to violent crime, and we're not doing a darn thing about it. And so the idea that we can build enough prison cells or enough walls to keep crime out and keep people safe is false. And that's where I'm not sure there's any industry, if we were doing it the same way now that we were doing it 40, 50, 60 years ago, we would say that's a good thing. And criminal justice is no exception. We have learned a ton in the last 40, 50, 60 years about what works and what doesn't. And so it is sort of, it seems sort of obvious, right? That if you put a person, and let me be clear on this. So the Sixth Circuit, prior to this last fiscal year, the pandemic has been a huge outlier when it comes to crime, and we can touch on that later. But prior to this last fiscal year, the Sixth Circuit, these two counties, put more people in prison than any other circuit in Florida, which of course includes Miami-Dade, the 11th Circuit, which is almost twice the size in population, and Miami, and we put more people in prison. And about 50% of the people we're putting in prison are going for nonviolent crime here. And so this is what to kind of get back on track when I talk about things that don't make a whole lot of sense. If you put people in prison for low-level nonviolent crime, particularly like drug possession, things that are related to that person's own personal addiction, personal mental illness, poverty, some milieu of all of those circumstances. You put them in the Department of Corrections, where we provide little to no rehabilitative services. Most of our prisons aren't even air conditioned anymore at this point. And then those folks get out of prison, with the same circumstances that got them in there. And now they're convicted felons. And we pretend to be shocked when those folks reoffend. And so the idea of just being able to punish the crime without any forward thinking is antiquated. And those policies have been shown over time with data and anecdotal evidence to not work to keep anybody safer. And so that's what I take offense to, is this labeling of who I am, which is not who I am, and this messaging that these policies are what's necessary to keep people safe, when everybody who's perpetuating those messages knows that's not true.
Okay, it's fear mongering. It's maybe a strategic political campaign tactic to win votes, to take votes away from you. Maybe, I don't know, but
and like, I want to say too that like I am running to represent Pinellas and Pasco counties, counties of which I'm very fond. Both counties. I was working in Pasco. I'm a tremendous fan of Pasco County. I live in St. Pete. So like, to suggest that I would try to do something that they're doing in New York or do something that they're doing in LA is preposterous, because we don't live in New York or LA and we don't have the same issues. And so that's where we're trying to appeal to people's fear. You're right. The fear mongering and the emotional appeal, when all I want to do is make these communities safer in ways that we know will likely reduce recidivism and violent crime.
Okay, so Samuel Ronan, thank you for tuning in. Much love to Allison. You have somebody, a supporter.
Much love to Samuel Ronan.
Thank you for joining this evening. Again, for those of you who are joining in, you can call in, either interact with Allison via the comments. I'll post them if you have a question, or if you want to call in, 813-221-9700 and ask her a question. The death penalty. Some people might think, well, when you left the public defender's office, you were part of the capital death division.
Yes. And I'm still
capital punishment. Yeah.
So I don't want to mislead. I'm still defending capital cases. I've tried 3 capital cases in the last 11 months while running for state attorney.
Okay, so for those in the public that might have a concern that making you voting for you, putting you in that office may impact you pursuing death on cases that merit it.
I will seek the death penalty if that's what justice demands. I wouldn't take an oath to do something. I try to be my authentic self. It probably doesn't make me a great politician. I think the death penalty generally is a bad idea for a lot of reasons. Pragmatically, it doesn't deter crime. I've never had a single client that thought to himself or herself, I shouldn't do this. I might get the death penalty. And that's what I mean. It has no deterrent effect. But if the death penalty did serve as a deterrent, if it prevented one person from being victimized, I would be hugely in favor of it.
Okay.
But that's not how it works. But regardless, my and what we ask of jurors is to put aside your personal biases and follow the law. And I would not have undertaken this task if I couldn't do that. And so I intend to seek the death penalty if I believe that justice demands it. I am 100% in charge and will make that decision. However, I don't think that one person should be the sole arbiter of that decision. And so I intend to have a panel of 3 to 5 people, both supporters, opponents, and supporters of the death penalty, that work in my office and will make a recommendation to me about whether they believe capital punishment is appropriate. Or us seeking capital punishment.
That's great. That's a great mechanism. For those of you that have joined, Haiti Oropesa with Florida U Judge joining me tonight, Allison Miller. She's seeking to be the next state attorney in the for the Sixth Circuit of Florida that it covers Pinellas and Pasco. If you'd like to call in, you may do so at 813-221-9700, or you can also interact, ask questions of Allison at her candidacy through the comment sections. I'll post your comments, questions, and so that she can address them. Let's go on real quickly. I've gone over your website, and I'm gonna go ahead and share it with the public. For those of you who may not, who are not on now, who will be, and see this as a pre-record, so that you can get informed, especially if you're going to be voting in either Pinellas or Pasco, so that you're acquainted with her platform. I'm gonna go ahead and share that. Here are the issues, and I did go over that. Before I go over some of the issues that you have on your website, w- before we completely segue from the doubts that some voters may have due to the fact that you do represent persons that the state is seeking to put to death, and that you're not gonna you're gonna be able to, as you said, follow the law and still seek death in appropriate cases. Um, Maybe some recent history in the 2016 election, there was a prosecutor who was voted in Orange County. I'm sure you're very well aware who,
I know Aramis.
right? You know Aramis, and who, after being elected, and she's looked at as a progressive liberal,
Yep.
right? That's the stereotypical type of state attorney candidate that, you know, somebody that's running with a law and order platform are going to try to dissuade the voters from voting for. So,
Can I share just a couple things before we move on? I mean, first
sure.
off, the death penalty is worth so much more political capital in this state than it's deserving. There are 320 people on death row in this state. There are maybe 20 people facing capital punishment in Pinellas and Pasco County right now. There are also 90,000 incarcerated inmates in the Florida Department of Corrections. Again, Pinellas and Pasco responsible for putting a good chunk of those folks there. And our
Yeah.
circuit is currently prosecuting tens of thousands of cases. And so I mean, that is a soundbite that people are using against me. When I have unequivocally always said, if I'm going to hold this position, I will follow the law. I understand what happened with Aramis Ayala. I was intimately involved as I was defending someone whose prosecution was removed to the Fifth Circuit. And I don't have a desire to follow in her footsteps. There's much about Aramis that I respect, but I will seek the death penalty if it's what justice requires. But I also want to be really clear about why I do what I do. So the Fifth Amendment guarantees a defendant the right to due process. And as I said, I believe very strongly in all 10 of the amendments. And after I was victimized, I started working with victims of violent crime and next of kin of homicide victims, particularly with the local diocese and the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops. And the two common complaints are, in this circuit, the most common complaint is they can't get a hold of the prosecutor, that they never know the victims or next of kin never know what's going on. But the most common complaint across the state of Florida is no one really told me how it was going to be. And so that's where, if you truly believe in giving people closure, I think we need to re-examine what our goals are. Because in order for someone to ever be eligible for a death warrant in this state, they have to go to trial, be convicted and sentenced to die, which is becoming less and less frequent given the requirement for unanimity in capital sentencing. Then that defendant goes through direct appeal, if convicted and sentenced to die, which takes years. Then that defendant goes through post-conviction, which takes years. And at any point, a court could overturn all of it, part of it, either the conviction or the sentence, and remand for a new trial or a new sentencing proceeding. After post-conviction, then we go through federal habeas. And so even if the state courts are perceived as one way, at some point, the defendant will have the opportunity to have his or her case heard in federal court, which takes years. And then we go through a round of clemency before the defendant is ever even eligible for a death warrant. And there are probably about 60 people on Florida's death row right now eligible for a warrant who will have lifetime appointed counsel. And there is no limit on the post-conviction or appellate claims that lifetime appointed counsel, can file on behalf of that person. And so I heard at a judicial conference, actually, next of kin of homicide victims speaking. And 100% of them, and they weren't all next of kin of homicide victims that were killed via first-degree murder. Some were second-degree murder, manslaughter, etc. But 100% of those people said that if they knew now what they, if they knew then what they knew now, they would have agreed to a plea deal so it could have been over. And I will never tell a person how to grieve, but unfortunately, the criminal justice system is not able to bring the healing that we so wish we could give to these people. If it did, again, my perspective would be vastly different. But so I find that next of kin, particularly in capital cases, are used as political pawn in the pursuits of the prosecution, and they're misled as to the realities of how the system is going to go. The most common reason these cases get overturned on appeal or in post-conviction is because the defendants did not have good lawyers. They had ineffective representation. And so if you want true closure and the case to be over, even if you are a supporter of the death penalty, the thing that you should want the most is for the defendant to have the absolute best representation the first go round so that the case doesn't get overturned and done a million times.
Okay. That was a lot, and that was a lot of good stuff right there. I want to talk about, and because I know this is true, because I brought this to the attention of the some of the private defense attorneys and public defenders here locally. A couple of years ago, I sent out a mass email to a list that I administer, where there's a lot of attorneys on that list, about the number of imprisonments in the state that stem from, the one on the top of the list was the Sixth Circuit.
Yeah.
So talk about the problems with that.
Well, and that's where, like, the idea is, if you put everybody in prison, no, that's not even the idea, right? The focus here is entirely punishment. There's been a crime. How do we punish it? And that's but part of what the law requires, right? In Florida, we have individualized sentencing. And so not only do we punish the crime, we punish the person who committed the crime, because not all people are the same. If you have two people who commit the same crime, one who's profoundly brain damaged and one who isn't, the law says we don't punish those two people the same. But kind of regardless of that, the focus has been on punishment for punishment's sake alone pretty much forever here, without any forward thinking as to what happens when this person gets out of prison. And I, as a defense attorney, I haven't always defended capital crimes. Most of my clients are never getting out of prison. But when I was a mainline felony attorney, the conversations I would have with prosecutors to be like, what happens when this person gets out of prison? And it was just like, that's not really my concern. And I'm like, it should be your concern. I believe the purpose of criminal justice should be public safety.
Right, because if you come out and you're jacked up worse than when you went in, recidivism, and then the public safety is put at risk.
Right. And so it's not like some of these, like juvenile justice is probably my primary agenda that I think we need, or primary platform item that I think we need reform on. Right. And some of these statistics that exist seem so obvious. You're like, I'm not really sure why this statistic needs to exist. If you put a child in prison, he or she is way more likely to reoffend when he gets released by committing a crime of violence than if you had not put the child in prison. Right. And so it doesn't just benefit the child to not go to prison. It benefits the community to have a child who's hopefully rehabilitated and goes on to live a law-abiding, productive life. Right. I mean, I defended a man when I was with the public defender's office. The case is still pending. And he's alleged to have shot 6 people, killing 4. And the state of Florida is seeking the death penalty. This man was first sent to prison when he was 16 years old for 2 counts of possession of cocaine. And the path from where he went into the system and where he is now is almost a direct line. And so he is 100% responsible if he is in fact guilty of these charges, but the blood is equally on the hands of the people who put a child in prison for possession of cocaine.
And so let's talk about mental health.
Sure.
Not only rehabilitation, but mental health, addressing that. You don't heal a mental health issue in prison, or do you?
Correct. No, you don't. We don't provide. I mean, some of the private prisons have more rehabilitative services than the state prisons. But even those are limited. And I think generally what the American Psychiatric Association would say, what we know about mental health is trying to treat mental health in confinement. Particularly, we have a prison system that uses isolation confinement as a tool of discipline in a way that's inconsistent with what's recommended by the American Psychiatric Association. In fact, again, not going to be surprised by this. There's only 2 states that continue to use isolation confinement as a means of discipline, in wild contradiction with what the American Psychiatric Association suggests, and those states are Florida and Texas. But yeah, no, you don't get better in prison, especially as a child, right? If as a child or somebody who's more vulnerable due to mental illness, you are prey. And so we put people in the Department of Corrections as prey, and they come out no better. If not, more likely they come out worse because we've made them predators.
And so could we have improvement in the area of juvenile justice here in the Sixth Circuit?
Sure. And so,
and listen, folks, those of you who are listening now or who will listen, it doesn't sometimes really matter to you until it's your child.
Right. Well, that's part of it, right? Is we always see this as the other, right? It's if it's not affecting us, I think it's really hard to identify with it. And that's where, I grew up with really conservative parents in a fairly affluent area in Orlando, and I was held at gunpoint when I was 15. And so crime doesn't discriminate. And so that's what, there are not walls we can build high enough or big enough. There are not enough prisons. We can't incarcerate everyone. And even if that was something people wanted to do, which I suggest we shouldn't, we have learned over time that it doesn't actually improve public safety. In fact, it makes it worse if you incarcerate people without providing any rehabilitative services. But
and here's a thing that most voters care about:
money.
Yeah, and how much does that cost?
Well, this is
what's the cost? The tax bill,
right? And I want to
sending everybody up the road and sending them to prison.
Well, I want to come back to juvenile too, but so let me just get one of the statistics that I said, and I'm a big fan of the numbers and data, and they mostly come from the Florida Department of Corrections or the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. So there's no suggestion that I'm biased. These are their numbers. So in the years of 2017 and 2018, again, because the pandemic has been an outlier when it comes to crime and crime reporting. So those 2 years we measured, what did people go to prison for? What was the most serious charge people went to prison for? And then we added up the total length of sentences. And so the 4th most serious charge people went to prison for in Pinellas and Pasco County in 2017 and 2018 was possession of controlled substance. My child has just walked in.
Hi, tell her to come to the camera.
Come say hi.
Hi.
We got you the pizza.
Thank you. You have to give me a So in 2017 and 2018, the 4th most serious charge these 2 counties sent people to prison for was possession of controlled substance, which is obviously possession of some substance other than marijuana, and not connected with sale, right? Because this is the most serious charge people were in prison for. And when the total length of sentences for people in prison for possession of controlled substance from Pinellas and Pasco in 2 years was 718.56 years. Okay. And the Department of Corrections estimates the cost of incarceration for an inmate in general population with no specialized health needs at about $25,000 a year. So we're talking about $15 million to incarcerate people in 2 years from 2 counties just for possession of controlled substance. And that's where when I say I don't think it's a partisan issue, if I'm talking to Republicans or Democrats, hey, Annie, when I'm talking to Republicans or Democrats and I say, do you think it makes you safer to put someone in prison for possessing drugs likely related to that person's own drug abuse or mental health issues? The answer is unequivocally no. And then when I said, do you think it's a good use of your taxpayer dollars, knowing it costs about $25,000 a year to incarcerate someone? The answer is also unequivocally no.
No, I agree with you. I'm an independent. I was a Republican my whole from early adulthood to in 2020, I became an independent. So I agree with you. I think that either Republicans or Democrats, they don't want their tax money going to fund the state up in prison for a controlled substance charge.
And to go back to juvenile justice too, Haiti, you and I have had these conversations too about equity in sentencing. And so one of the things that I intend to do as state attorney is to measure every place that there's prosecutorial discretion afforded, right? Whether it's charging decisions, sentence recommendation, diversion eligibility, capital punishment, juvenile direct file, whatever it is, I intend to measure that we're doing it with racial parity. And if we're not going to do it, right? Because if you're violating somebody's civil rights or a lot of people's civil rights in pursuit of it, it can't possibly be legal. And so one of the things that really jumped out at me when we were talking about juvenile justice is Pinellas's population is only about 18% Black. But last year, 71% of the children who were charged as adults in Pinellas were Black. And so if you are 2 to 3 times more likely to be charged as an adult, if you are a child of color, there's a problem. And I'm sort of used to kind of the trope from the state attorney's office being, I don't know the race of the defendant.
Yeah, that's true. And I attended a forum where the late Bernie McCabe was present as a panelist. I was right there in the front row.
I was there too.
You were? Okay. So, and I remember that he was being urged by some other persons on the panel, one of them, Renee Flowers, to take an implicit bias test. And he said, no, there's no reason to do that. But yet he was being shown numbers that were completely lopsided in favor of white children.
Right.
So,
and it's like, I think that's, and Bernie actually said at that forum that he doesn't know the race of the child that he directs.
I heard him say that.
Unless he stereotypes based on an apostrophe in the child's name. And while tone deaf, it certainly illustrates the point that you always know the race of the person. It's just nonsense to suggest otherwise. But if things are as disparate as they are, and the state attorney's office truly doesn't know the race of the children they're direct filing, but it's just coincidentally happening.
It's not coincidental.
Right. But my point is, like, if you don't know and it's this bad, then you should know. So,
or have the implicit bias testing of the persons who make these decisions on who's going to be direct filed or not.
Right. And I thought it was really interesting at that panel because Sheriff Gualtieri and Chief Holloway also participated as panelists, and both of them had participated in implicit bias testing, as well as had their departments or agencies do it. And so having more information is never a bad thing, right? Maybe you take the implicit bias
absolutely
test,
not.
Turns out you have zero implicit bias. I think that unlikely. And it's not about calling anybody racist. It's uncovering internal biases that you might not recognize that you have, but they're motivating policies and decisions that are impacting people's lives.
For sure. It's 6:33. We've been going on for 30 minutes. And for those of you who are tuning in, you can call if you'd like, 813-221-9700 if you have a question for Allison, or you may ask via the comments section there. And I'm sure she's going to be happy to engage with you. Again, when is the election?
It is November 8th, 2022. The end of qualifying is Friday. And so neither myself nor Mr. Bartlett will have an opponent in the primary unless somebody files and qualifies in the next 2 days. And so then, there will be no primary election in August. We will meet in the general election, November 8th, on the same ballot as the gubernatorial race, the Senate race, the congressional races that we've been talking about. So,
and so that is, Allison, do you know the URL real quick? So Miller for state attorney. Let me go ahead and
MillerForStateAttorney.com. Yep. Yeah, and I'd catch my child and husband out until 6:30.
Oh, it looks. I'm glad they're floating around there in the background. It looks like it looks. You know what it looks like? It looks like a family that appreciates public safety. And
well, that's what like I've had former prosecutors say to me, like, as a mom, I'm just worried, and I'm like, as a mom, I'm offended by that suggestion because I equally take there is no greater role in my life than protecting my child. I do most of what I do because I'm motivated by her, and it will make me emotional even talking about it. And so the idea, that's where, Florida currently has the largest school shooting in American history. That trial is taking place in Broward County, right? Nicholas Cruz is on trial for shooting and killing 17 people and shooting and injuring another 17, and is facing the death penalty. And he committed those crimes when he was 19 years old. And so my child has to participate in active shooter drills at her school that she started doing when she was 4 and 5 years old. And so the idea that we're going to do more of the same without tackling some of the roots and the causes of these things that are happening became untenable to me. I could not participate. I consider myself a student of criminal justice. Again, and I've participated on both sides. I haven't been a prosecutor, but I have participated as a victim and victim advocate. And it reached a point where I couldn't be a cog in this wheel without trying to effectuate the change that I think we so desperately need.
All right, let's go real quickly over some of the diversion programs.
Yep.
Let's talk about that.
Well, I think that's if I could say there's one thing, right? Because if we talk about mass incarceration and reducing mass incarceration as a means to making our community more safe, having more treatment or diversion opportunities on the front end, again, doesn't just benefit the person who's found himself or herself in trouble. It benefits the community for that person to be made whole. And so I think there's a couple areas where our diversion programs are lacking. And I'm thrilled to see that the Sixth Circuit is finally starting a mental health court. But I suspect, like drug court and veterans treatment court, that the state attorney's office will serve as the sole gatekeeper for access to those programs. And so one of the main problems is who the state attorney's office is identified as disqualified from those programs. And that's where one of the most disparate areas of prosecutorial discretion that I think most people don't even think about is who we're offering diversion to. And it's super interesting because I've met with Sheriff Gualtieri, and one of the things that he's most proud of is APAD, the Adult Pre-Arrest Diversion Program. And they're doing great stuff. And some of that's going to happen pre-arrest and some of that's going to happen post-arrest. But we need more expansive diversion programs. We also need a way for people to successfully complete those programs without money being a barrier to their success. And we also need to provide more comprehensive services, right? And so I think we have started to understand in a more meaningful way that crimes are committed because of mental health issues or drug dependency. Poverty is the main driver of crime. Lack of opportunity, lack of access, lack of job training. And so as a component of our diversion programs, we are going to start offering job training and educational opportunities. I am focused on following the law. The law in Florida says we punish the crime, but we have individualized sentencing because not every person who commits the same crime should be treated the same way. And so we're going to have diversion programs that more specifically treat the needs of the people that have, again, found themselves in trouble, not just for the benefit of rehabilitating that person, which obviously is huge. Providing a pathway to redemption, I think, is the most critical component of the criminal justice system. But in doing so, we also make the community safer because we hopefully give those people the tools they need to be successful that they otherwise didn't have. And so that they can go on to live law-abiding, productive lives. I mean,
right. And we're not talking about super serious criminal charges. We're talking about, there's a criteria for, that's implemented, that's used now, pretrial intervention, but maybe you want to kind of, I don't know, things can always be improved. I don't see how anyone could ever be against, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, giving somebody a second chance.
Right. Well, and for instance, veterans treatment court, one of the things that makes you ineligible or they're less likely to consider your application is if you didn't see active combat. And certainly we respect our service people that saw active combat, but we have a tremendous amount of service people who volunteered to die for our country. And even though they didn't see active combat,
we're stressed about having to be active.
But as far as I can tell, that policy seems to necessarily include the United States Navy. And as the granddaughter of 2 service people who served in the Navy, I have a really hard time with that. I think you know this. I wrote a bill to extend ineligibility for the death penalty to include the seriously mentally ill. And I wrote the bill because I was tired of representing veterans who had profound service-related trauma, who committed capital crime. And again, I want to be really clear. It's not about not holding people accountable for their actions. I grew up with really conservative parents. I've said that before. I believe in accountability. I think accountability looks different depending on the crime and depending upon the person. And so in my mind, if you have offered to die for our country and in the process of that service, you developed profound service-related trauma that led to you committing this crime, we're going to hold you accountable. I just don't believe it looks like the ultimate punishment. And I also think veterans should have access to far more expensive treatment and therapeutic courts than they do now.
I don't understand real quickly.
Sure.
What's the difference between why? What's the rationale between we'll go ahead and give for the veterans the ability to do the diversion, but not the ones that didn't see
well, I mean,
or not in active combat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speculate. I don't like to put words in other people's mouths, but when resources are limited, you have to draw the line somewhere, is my guess. And so the thought is, if you saw active combat, you're perhaps more likely to have profound service-related trauma.
Gotcha.
But things, I mean, that's where, you know, we're understanding the trauma of military service outside active combat. And I had cases where the state attorney's office, it was usually Carrie Lapka who I was communicating with, who would say, you know, we'll send us a letter, let us know, you know, what other circumstances lead this veteran to be in need of services. And so I can't say they didn't consider those circumstances. I'm not sure I ever had anybody who was admitted who didn't see active combat. And that's where, like, I mean, I think we can all appreciate you could have a tremendous amount of trauma on an aircraft carrier, even if you're not boots on the ground in war, which isn't to minimize the service of any service person.
Okay, so marijuana, that's on your website.
Yep. I am not going to prosecute simple possession of marijuana. I don't think it does a darn thing to make any of us safer to prosecute marijuana. I think marijuana is already legal if you're white. I think we all know that Black and brown folks are far more likely to be prosecuted for marijuana, and it cost us a tremendous amount of money. So if the substance that's suspected to be marijuana contains less than a certain percentage, I think it's like 0.03% of THC, we consider the substance in Florida to be hemp, which I'm not really sure is a thing, but that's what the law is, and it's legal. So if the substance has less than a certain percentage of THC, it's hemp, and therefore it's legal. And in order for the state now to prosecute marijuana or something suspected to be marijuana, all of those substances have to go through toxicological testing. And then I think about, you know, as a misdemeanor public defender, I was in trial defending, you know, folks that were pulled over and would have like marijuana residue or shake on their lap. And they were prosecuted, facing the possibility of incarceration. And you'd have 2 public defenders in court. You'd have 2 assistant state attorneys. You'd have a judge. You'd have all the deputies, the clerk, the court personnel, and like the cost of that.
Right. And holding up other cases that are more important than that.
And that's where, like, marijuana is legal in certain states. It's medicinally legal here. There is no evidence that suggests prosecuting marijuana. And that's what, you know, I was talking about this with a colleague at the public defender's office the other day. I am unfamiliar with, I mean, you think about the violence that surrounds the buying and selling of illegal drugs. Right. And so I am unaware of any marijuana dispensary in Pinellas or Pasco County being robbed at gunpoint. But I had a client who jumped the counter at a CVS to steal hydrocodone. He had no prior record, used a gun, pistol whipped the clerk, jumped the clerk to steal pills because of his addiction. And I'm like, that doesn't happen at marijuana dispensaries as far as I'm aware of.
Wow, get him a medical marijuana card.
Yeah, but when we talk about there is no physiological evidence about addiction to marijuana. Like there is addiction. I believe addiction is a disease as it relates to.
Well, some people are going to disagree. They're going to say that there's psychological addiction to marijuana.
I appreciate that argument. But I think we can agree that there's a physiological difference as far as somebody who's a repeat or routine user of marijuana versus somebody who's addicted to cocaine or prescription narcotics. But yeah.
And you know what? I'm not a psychic. I don't have a crystal ball, but if I were to bet, and I don't bet, but if I were to bet, I think already half of the country, the states either recreationally, or medicinally, they're there. And pretty soon now the federal government, the Congress is seeking to legalize marijuana too. It's a plant.
Yeah. I mean, that's
It's a plant, folks. It's a plant.
You can still go to prison for marijuana here. If you possess more than 20 grams or in.
I don't think there's a documented case of an overdose.
No, I don't think so either.
But alcohol, go check the numbers on alcohol.
Well,
and the pharmaceuticals, the opioids, which.
Right. Well, and that's what the thing we were talking about with violence is being unaware of any, dispensaries being robbed at gunpoint is think about all of the crime that was experienced around like distilleries during Prohibition. And as soon as Prohibition ended, and I'm not suggesting we should legalize drugs, quite to the contrary. I just think the criminal prosecution of marijuana, to the extent that we're incarcerating people for it, is tremendously expensive. It's racially disparate, and it doesn't do a darn thing to make anybody safer.
The license suspension, if they're adjudicated.
Right. That's what
now they can't
that's what they should put on billboards.
And they subject themselves to more arrests if they're driving with a license that's suspended.
Right. Right. So that's what we incarcerate for marijuana, but we also take your driver's license. And then when you drive on a suspended license to get to work to pay your court costs, we prosecute you for driving while license suspended or revoked. We also send people to prison for driving while license suspended or revoked. And so that's, I heard
more money, more money, more problems, like Biggie Smalls said.
I know, but again, we have nearly 90,000 incarcerated inmates in the Florida Department of Corrections. I heard Secretary Ricky Dixon, Secretary of the Department of Corrections, ask for $100 million for DOC this legislative session. And I don't know, frankly, how much money he got, if any. And he may need every bit of it. I have no idea. There's certainly a crumbling infrastructure, but that's where sometimes we do things that are so counterintuitive to the end.
Right. You're throwing money at something and then you got to throw more money on it because it becomes a problem instead of a solution.
Right. That's what I use this as, by way of example, the fact that we don't air condition the majority of the state prisons, and death row is not air conditioned. And I think I may be the only state attorney candidate that spent a considerable amount of time in the Department of Corrections. And, people say to me all the time, these people are folks that have committed the worst of the worst. They're slated for execution. We shouldn't air condition. And it's certainly not limited to just death row.
You know what? But okay, so now that you said that, well, these folks, some of them might be innocent.
Sure. Florida actually leads the country in exonerations from death row.
That is true.
The national average is 1 in 9. Ours is 1 in 3, which is kind of gross. We've exonerated 31 people from death row, executed 99. It's in the modern era of the death penalty. But my point of that, even if you're okay, these people don't deserve kind of human decency, the thermal index in the Department of Corrections in the summer reaches 180 degrees. And we're in Florida. And so most of us here are familiar with the idea of prolonged heat exposure. And it leads to dehydration, heat stroke, mental health issues, aggression. And so that's where I'm who pays when our inmates get sick because of prolonged heat exposure? We do, the taxpayers. And that's when I think to myself about death row. It's isolation confinement, 23 of every 24 hours a day. The inmates are housed in 6x8 cells, unair conditioned. So we take people who the law considers to be the worst of the worst, who have committed the worst crimes. We put them in a little steel box and we heat them up to ungodly temperatures. And then we wonder why things happen. I'm that's where I feel like I'm the law and order candidate.
So what's up with cruel and unusual?
Yeah, it's been challenged. The last successful challenge that I can think of in the Department of Corrections involved the isolation confinement on death row, and DOC was ordered to build some different facilities, and they just said, we don't have the money. Can't get blood from a turnip.
We're using them with all those mass incarcerations for controlled substance charges.
Well, yeah, and the prisons are largely self-sustaining, right? The majority of the labor in the Department of Corrections is provided by the inmates. But that's where I'm not prison reform is not part of my platform, right? I'm not responsible as the state attorney for correcting the conditions in the Department of Corrections. Certainly, I think we have to have a larger conversation about how we incarcerate our inmates. But my point is, how this demonstrates lack of forward thinking, that we put people in prison.
Yeah, but you can be a part of prison reform without even being about prison reform with
Sure.
having a model in place where you're looking at cases and you're saying, okay, this merits prison, this does not. These are the cons of
well, and I think that's
having
part
this.
of it, right? Is if I can't control how the Department of Corrections, I can't control the legislature. I can't control how much money they're going to allocate to the Department of Corrections. I can't control how the Department of Corrections.
But you can control who goes up there and who shouldn't.
Correct. And so that's what, I think I have a better understanding of the Department of Corrections, having spent a considerable amount of time in some of our maximum security prisons and some of our minimum security prisons.
And you're making a quality assurance purpose call as to being entrusted by the public when they trust you with saying, you know what, I'm going to take a chance on you because I believe you really do care about public safety. You want to take care of us, but you're not, and you're going to take care of us too, with a tax bill that isn't higher than it needs to be.
Right. Well, and it's people are inherently self-interested or self-motivated, right? And so I'm I live here with my family. Of course, my primary concern is public safety. As a defense attorney, I saw my role as an advocate for justice. And as a state attorney, I see my role as an advocate for justice.
And you've been a victim of crime twice, and serious ones.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. I was a science major in college. I always thought I was going to go to med school. I was a biology major. I was always very interested in science. I went to the International Science Fair in high school. I was a big dork. But yeah, because of some of the things that happened to me in college, I ended up failing organic chemistry. And so I couldn't graduate. I was well, I'm not doing that again. And so I couldn't graduate with a biology degree. I happened to be double majoring in political science, and I had a minor in international peace studies. And so I was able to graduate on time, but majoring in political science. I switched colleges at the University of Notre Dame my senior year. But yeah, the course of my life was redirected because of the fact that I was a victim of violent crime. And so
yeah, listen,
my heart breaks. That's why I have worked with victims of violent crime. I've worked with next of kin. I think too, that's something, victims of domestic violence. I think a lot of people have been affected by that. I have a close family member who's been a victim of domestic violence. And so that's something I think is interesting, is that my opponent is very much championed himself, the victim's rights guy. And almost all of the domestic violence advocacy groups in these counties support me.
So I grew up like you in a very conservative Republican household, and my mom freaked out when I said, I think I'm going to be a criminal defense attorney. And but she has since come to be as passionate as I in understanding the value of not only protecting the community, right, from persons that would harm us, but also understanding that we don't want to have somebody that's innocent incarcerated, punished because they didn't commit a crime. Those two things are equally important.
I know. Well, and sort of the message that's missing too is, when we talk about innocent people in prison, one of the cases I was involved in when I was at the public defender's office, Steve Cannon, is a case that Bruce actually prosecuted. And Steve was sentenced to life in prison as a juvenile homicide offender, not eligible for the death penalty, because Roper was decided that says children shall not be eligible for the death penalty. And there is incredibly credible forensic evidence that exonerates both Steve Cannon as well as his co-defendant, Gary Cochran. And they have been convicted of the rape and murder of a 9-year-old little girl in Dade City. And I think what people are missing is, not only is that a horrible injustice if these two men are serving life sentences for a crime they didn't commit, but the bigger point is that if they didn't commit these crimes, the person who did rape and murder a little girl, raped and murdered a little girl, has been free and continues to be free. And so as somebody who was a victim of violent crime, I can say unequivocally, I want the actual perpetrator to be serving the time for the crime. But also, if our purpose and our mission is to make these communities safe, putting the wrong people in prison while the while the actual guilty perpetrators go free. And, you know, it has been my experience that most
We'll
people
produce more victims.
Right. That most people that
Potentially.
rape and murder little girls and don't get caught don't necessarily stop doing it. And so I find that the idea of innocent people being in prison gross, but I find it gross in a larger sense or a bigger picture in that means the actual perpetrator remains free.
Okay, so in 5 minutes, we're going to hit 1 hour.
Okay.
It's been a great flow. A lot of things covered. This is, I think, a great segue into a wrongful conviction unit, which is very popular now. It's a great thing with progressive candidates, persons that have been elected to the state attorney's offices. As we were saying, there's people that you were talking about, inmates on death row burning up because people already think it's a foregone conclusion that they're guilty. They might be innocent regardless. Wrongful conviction unit. It's a great segue into that.
Right. Well, and that's where like people are inherently fallible. We're imperfect people. And so I don't know why we would expect the results of our criminal justice system to be perfect or to be infallible. Right. And so the goal is like the state attorney by law is called the minister of justice. And so if it is our responsibility on both sides of the aisle, both prosecution and defense, to ensure that justice is seen or sought, then we should want to make sure that all of our convictions are good. And we have to operate under the assumption that some are going to be bad convictions, not necessarily through any malfeasance, some because of malfeasance, but just because we're imperfect and it's an imperfect system. And that's where I said before, and I stand by it, if we have the wrong people in prison, that in and of itself is an injustice, but it also means the people who actually committed the crimes remain free. And so, and I think I said this to you also, maybe in another conversation, the conviction integrity unit will be part of our larger civil rights unit, where we're measuring the racial parity. Again, I know I already discussed that, at any avenue where prosecutorial discretion is afforded. And so I think that like protecting civil rights, due process rights, that all goes hand in hand with what the role of the state attorney is.
Okay, so real bail reform. I think that's the other thing that's on your, and modernization of the state attorney's office.
Yeah. Bail reform. And that's where, again, I'm not New York City. I'm not Los Angeles. Okay. In February of I believe 2021, now the years are getting lost in my mind, but I believe it was still when I was with the public defender's office. A gentleman died in the jail, excuse me. His name was Alfred Woodard, and he was in custody for 2 misdemeanors, petty theft and trespass from Walmart. And the judge at advisories actually raised his bond because he had a history of petty theft and trespass from Walmart. And I think, again, this is a universally held belief that no matter how many times you've stolen from Walmart, I don't think you should be condemned to die. And I think most people agree that that's not warranting of a life sentence. And so the point of bail, and that's where, again, I am deeply rooted and study the law. The presumptive bail for low-level, nonviolent misdemeanors, victimless misdemeanors, is ROR, releasing the defendant on his or her own recognizance. The second level of bail is what's considered non-secure bail, where you get out, and then if you fail to appear, you owe money. And we have totally just eliminated that from our system, it seems, in Pinellas, Pasco. And then only third, right, is the idea that of secure or cash bail, where you have to pay money to be released from custody. And so my idea is consistent with the law, that the nonviolent and the indigent should get out. I don't believe in coercive plea bargaining. I don't believe in incarceration as a means to effectuate pleas. Our system was founded on a system of trials, not a system of pleas. And I think the dangerous should stay in custody. And so right now we have far too many indigent, nonviolent people in jail who shouldn't be there. It's not a good use of our taxpayer dollars. And
right, because we have to house them and pay for, and you know what? It does make sense. If you're indigent and it's not a violent offense, yeah, you should be let out pending the resolution of your case. Or like you said, anything that's non-violent, Yeah, because it is coercive. There are people in jail, and they might even be innocent, and
Right.
because they're gonna lose their jobs, homes, they're gonna just go ahead and take the plea.
Right. And that's where, like, I've heard, prosecutors or the judges say, like, well, it's only 10 days or it's only 30 days. And it's like, have you ever spent 30 days in jail?
No doubt. Me too.
Right.
When I start talking to clients about, look, this is what they're seeking, I always say, look, I'm not talking lightly about that because I've never been in jail and I don't want to go to jail.
And like spending a month in jail is potentially life ending for folks, not in a literal way like Mr. Woodard dying, but like you lose employment, you potentially
It would
lose
jack
housing.
us up. It would jack me up to be in jail for a month.
Of course. Of
And not
course.
just financially. Not
Right.
that it would it's in other aspects.
We're
I think
both
I'd be fine
caretakers.
financially, but there are things that I need to be on the outs for.
Right. Right. And we're both caretakers. I mean, can you imagine? No. And then the
No.
last thing. Right. No. And that's where like
But here's the thing, we'd be able to bond out. So maybe it's not the best example. There are people that maybe they're
it depends. What crime are you committing, Haiti?
well, yeah.
Just teasing you.
That's true. This is true. But some people can't. And
Right.
they should.
Right. And that's what I've had prosecutors also say, like, the bail's only $1,000. They only need to come up with 10% of that, to go through a bondsman. And it's like, people don't have $100. Especially now, right?
And why even 1,000, especially if you are innocent?
Right. Right. And it's sort of like, if the bail's only $1,000, my counter argument is you're obviously not that concerned about this person getting out because the person is not truly a danger to the community or likelihood to reoffend or a flight risk to not appear for court. Right.
So here's the thing, so that nobody that's watching that might be told or be misinformed for someone's personal agenda into having you believe that this Alison Miller is going to wreak criminality havoc here. No, this makes sense. I don't see why that doesn't make sense. You're not suggesting that anybody that is charged with a violent crime that, let's just go ahead and help them and not put any conditions on. Right?
Right. I mean, that's what, like, as a defense attorney, most of my clients get life in prison without the possibility of parole.
You know who's not going to be happy with you?
Who? Lots of people? Who? I'm not sure.
Bail bonds industry.
I'm sure. But, that's what I've spoken to some bondsmen who agree. Like, I'm board certified in criminal trial law. I am truly a nerd and a student and a disciple of criminal justice. And my positions are consistent with the law. And so there are plenty of bondsmen that appreciate wanting to enforce the law and like don't have an interest. I mean, they're also taxpayers and live in these communities, right? And don't have any interest in their tax dollars going to incarcerate somebody pre-trial for trespass at a bus stop or or a public park or whatever.
All right, so I'm accessing your website again one more time. I'd like to share that.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No. So I want to just go ahead because that's it. We're wrapped up. I'm gonna let you address the viewers right before we sign off and say goodnight, so you could go back to your family that's enjoying a lot of
they went to
nice and quiet. It looks like you live in a nice neighborhood, and I'm sure you want to keep it like that without any crime or anything, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what, like, I don't know if you can see, I have there's like random fruit and vegetable balloons floating around my house. Dan Perry and I had a booth at the Clearwater Bar Association's Oyster Roast.
Oh, yeah. I saw pictures of that.
Dan's like Salad World, and Dan is like the most enthusiastic human I've ever met. And he had all of these balloons.
Yes, he is.
I have a broccoli. I was doing a Zoom the other day and somebody was like, I'm sorry, is there a broccoli floating on your ceiling? Yes, there is.
Was that Dan?
That did the
broccoli?
Yeah, hold on.
Dan is a fun one yeah. He is very enthusiastic. I saw him not too long ago.
Dan is just one of those.
He's a wonderful human being.
He is the most authentic, most genuine person.
For sure. Yes, he is. Hi, Dan, if you're watching, and if not,
He knows.
I think he is watching because I believe I saw a message here come by that he shared this broadcast. Okay, so anyways, it's 7:04. We're gonna be saying good night shortly, but you go ahead and you address the public, the electorate, those who will decide on their ballot who they will select, you or your opponent. Go ahead and make a pitch as to why you're the better candidate and why they should entrust you with their vote, so for you to lead.
Sure. I am somebody who has devoted my life to the criminal justice system and to the pursuit of justice. And I take making these communities, Pinellas and Pasco counties, tremendously seriously because of my role as a mother and just a participant in these communities. My opponent has said out loud, like it was a positive thing after serving at the state attorney's office for something like 42, 43 years, that the thing that makes that office the most effective is no change. And so if you think criminal justice is going well, if you feel like it's respecting and protecting everyone as it was intended to do, if you feel like it's making you safe, then you should probably vote for my opponent. But if you think we could do a whole heck of a lot better to make these communities safe, to be a better steward of the taxpayer's dollar, and hopefully provide a pathway to redemption, then you should definitely vote for me. My website is millerforstateattorney.com. I'm on all of the social media platforms. Certainly fundraising is a huge component to running for office. And so if any of you are so motivated, I would love or appreciate any consideration to donating to my campaign, which can be done at my website. And it's been a pleasure being here with you this evening, Haiti.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you for those of you that joined us. Please share, especially if you have family, friends, know someone that's going to vote in Pinellas and Pasco in 2022. That's when the election's going to take place. And thank you for joining. Thank you for coming on and taking some of your time from your family to address the voters. It's very important. Good night, everyone. Haiti Oropesa with Florida You Judge. Until next time.
Thanks, Haiti.